Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I'm
You're
Mark
under your
Nelson.
breath.
I'm the Senior Director for the Center for International Media Assistance here at the National Endowment for Democracy. I want to welcome you to our panel that we are calling Mediating Tolerance, Journalism and LGBTI Coverage in Sub-Saharan Africa. For those of you who are tweeting, we are asking you to use the hashtag MediaDev. It's on the screen up here. And there is Wi-Fi connectivity in the office, in the room, but please silence your ringers so that we don't get disturbed by telephone calls. For those of you who have been following SEMA events and our publications, you know that we have spent the last few years focused on the broader enabling environment and the governance conditions that produce the kind of media systems that we are seeing around the world. Journalism is facing a combination of challenges, from technology to the rise of authoritarianism and authoritarians who are trying to squelch independent voices, rich tycoons who are buying up weak media houses and using this media to promote their business interests or their political interests, and from the collapse of a business model that makes it really, really hard for independent media to survive in this environment. So these are issues where journalists themselves have not really been, they're more victims than they are perpetuating this situation. So they're victims rather than protagonists in this drama. And they've had not that much to do with this change in the environment that they're facing. But today's discussion is coming at this environment from a slightly different angle. And we're taking a slightly different path today. We'll be discussing a set of issues where journalists themselves can make a big difference in the way that they work, in the words that they use, and the way they conceptualize these issues. Of course, they face enormous pressures against them and that come from the enabling environment as well, so we're not abandoning that idea, but it is an area where we are seeing some changes that are coming about because of brave individuals like the ones we have as our guests today, and I think it's really encouraging to see this incredible panel that will be coming together and to learn from them how they've navigated this space, what they've learned, what works and what doesn't, and how they have confronted some of these issues about covering religion and LGBTIQ issues. Our moderator today is Brian Pelot, who is the Director of Global Strategy at the Religion News Foundation and Religion News Service, which is housed at, the Religion News Foundation is a secular educational nonprofit organization housed at the University of Missouri's Columbia campus, and that's as you know, that's the location of a really, really well-respected journalism school here in the United States. We got to know him better this year when he participated in the Africa-wide consultation that SEMA and Deutsche Welle Academy hosted in Durban, South Africa. We brought together there various representatives of the media, civil society, and political actors to discuss and try to understand more fully the challenges that are facing African media institutions today and what could be done about it. So we had a really, really interesting discussion there, and we drew up a set of ideas about what needs to be done next and who can help in this process. And this is one of 3 that we've done so far worldwide, and we're continuing to do these regional consultations around the world. We're delighted that Brian was able to come to this event and give his perspectives there and interact with the participants there. And we're really super delighted to have this distinguished panel of experts here who will, I'm sure, be a really great resource for us to learn from today. And I'm going to turn it over to Brian now, who will take it from there. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Mark. Is my mic on? Let's give Mark a round of applause. And thank you to the SEMA and to the NED staff for hosting us today for this lunch and for this discussion. Nick, we were in a meeting before, and Nick said we're on a road show, and we really are. This is the 3rd panel we've done in 1 week. We were in Nashville first at the Religion News Association conference, where the focus was really on religion more than anything, I think, in that discussion. Then we went to New York and we did a discussion at the LGBT Center there, where the focus was a bit more on LGBT rights. And now we're here with you all at NED and SEMA, where I think we might take more of a media, press freedom angle as we discuss, and I'm sure as the questions come from the audience. Before we launch in, it might be useful just to discuss why we're here, how we all came together in the first place, and how this program came together and came to fruition. So about a year ago, we got a grant from the Arcus Foundation to do a journalism workshop in Cape Town, where I'm based, Cape Town, South Africa, with 24 journalists from across sub-Saharan Africa to focus on how we can better report on these sensitive and often taboo topics: LGBTQI issues, sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and then religion. Often the overlap of those two issues is where things get very dicey and very complicated. So we assembled 24 journalists, and Sally was there as one of our regional trainers as well. And each of the journalists, after the training, put together a story, which they'll talk to you a bit about today, their stories that were produced. Throughout the workshop, we talked about some of the key issues around ethical human rights reporting principles, around using proper terminology, and using the terminology that your sources actually want you to use in whatever context, tips for reporting on religion, tips for source safety and sensitivity, and all of that and more, and the trainee stories are in this reporting guide, which is up here as well, covering sexual and gender minorities and religion in sub-Saharan Africa. There's a link for that right at the bottom there that's rather long. If you email me, I can just send you a copy. My email is just brian.pellet@religionnews.com. So since we're all journalists, I think the best place to start, as I said earlier, might be with those stories that we wrote. So I've asked Juana to start and talk about the story, how it came together, what the focus was, what some of the difficulties you faced in reporting on these topics, LGBT rights and religion. Yeah, and before I do that, thank you. I need to introduce everyone. The long bios are on the back page. I won't read through those, but let me at least tell you who's in front of us. It's basically moderator duty 101. We've got Wena Udubang. She's a Nigerian-based journalist, poet, and filmmaker. Next, we have Martha Mukewa, a columnist at The Namibian in Windhoek, Namibia. We have Ambrose Barigye, a Ugandan human rights activist and field director for the Kuchu Times Media Group. We have Sally Chum, who's the founder and executive director at Nanan Record, based in Nairobi, Kenya. And we have Eric Robinson, who's based here in DC. He's the associate director for Africa programs at the National Endowment for Democracy. So back to Juana. Tell us about your story, how it came to being.
So my story was about a young woman who had been through deliverance regarding being a lesbian, and basically, I think in America you call that conversion therapy. So she had been through that a few times, and basically was looking at her reconciling her faith and her sexuality, but also sort of in the offshoot was also the mental health implication of those experiences with people in the LGBT community, where they go through conversion therapy or having to perform straightness, and sort of the mental health implication of that as well. So that was what my story was looking at. That was what it was about. In terms of challenges, I pretty much had to go sort of through insider sources. So it's not very easy because Nigeria has anti-gay laws, which is the Same-Sex Prohibition Act, which basically criminalizes same-sex relationships. And essentially, it's not easy to just find people on the street. So you really have to go through sort of insiders within the community, and then people have to feel safe with you before you can get these kinds of stories. So I think that was definitely a challenge. But I was just very lucky to know someone who then went into the community and helped me and asked people if they were willing to talk about their experiences with conversion therapy.
And your story was published in The Guardian,
yes,
right?
It was published in the UK Guardian.
How was it perceived by local news audiences, and how was reporting on these topics often perceived?
So oftentimes when, with regards to sort of LGBT stories, they're either very, very sensationalized, and so very about the sexual act, and demonizing at the same time. So you either get that, or you get sort of conversations about the law, or debates about the law, but it's often very difficult to find stories that are humanizing people within that community. So it was very interesting. A lot of the reactions I was getting based on social media were quite positive. I was anticipating some negative or bigoted remarks, but I didn't get any. I was getting more people saying things like they're getting to understand things better, or thank you for telling the story in this way. And that was really kind of feedback that I was getting.
And then the topic, LGBT issues specifically, how are they often reported on and often perceived in Nigerian media?
As I said, we have an anti-gay laws, but at the same time, what people also say is that those laws just legitimize people's biases already. So a lot of the time, most of the coverage, as I said earlier, is very much sensationalist and very dangerous as well, because I don't know if you guys had read the story about the ringing up of a gay orgy. And the people who were involved they were arrested, and the press wrote out their names in the newspapers. Even on the radio station, they announced their names as well. So there's a lot of danger. Even the media actually helps in, exacerbating the situation and making it more dangerous to people within that community as well.
Martha, you wrote a very similar story, but from a very different context in Namibia. Tell us about that story, how it came together.
Sure.
Yeah.
My story is about praying the gay away. How I came to LGBT reporting in Windhoek in Namibia is actually through the arts. I know it's a cliche, but a lot of people in the arts are from the LGBT community. So I went out one day on my beat and to two developmental plays that were funded by the National Theatre, which is again funded by the government. And it turns out that the plays that were awarded that year were actually both dealing with issues from the LGBT community. And I thought that was really progressive. In Namibia, we don't have a anti-gay law. What we have is the criminalization of sodomy, and specifically to men. So not through heterosexual couples or anything like that. If a man has sex with a man, that is criminal, but it's not something that has ever been prosecuted, but the law stands. And that kind of creates stigma and bias and homophobia within the community. So I went to these two plays, and I thought that was quite progressive, and I reviewed the plays, and then I phoned the National Theatre because I wanted to do a follow-up story called The Rise of the Gay Play. So I phoned and I asked, wow, this is amazing, why did you do this? What do you have to say about this kind of thing, given the laws and given the climate in Namibia, which is quite homophobic? And they didn't want to comment, and they just said it was the best plays. They weren't trying to be political, they weren't trying to be activists or anything like that. So to create my second article, The Rise of the Gay Play, I interviewed a whole bunch of the cast. There were big ensemble casts of gay men. And something that stuck out in each of their stories is that they'd all had a religious intervention when they'd come out. Like, they were told to go pray. 97% of Namibians identify as Christian, and 50% of them identify as Lutheran. So it's quite a conservative Namibian society, Christian society. So all of them had these religious interventions in some way or another. So I thought that would be an interesting topic to have the confluence of religion and the LGBT community come together. So I had two subjects who I had just met, both artists, and I asked them specifically about their religious interventions to sort of pray the gay away. And the one had actually gone through quite a specific ceremony where they had a church prophet. It was a Pentecostal church, a church prophet, a church elder, and the gay man's mother come in and have like an actual ceremony where they had a sackcloth and ash and some oil. And the significance of those things were sackcloth, according to stories in the Old Testament, was for humility, ash was for repentance, and then oil is for healing. So they had all those elements coming through, praying in tongues, trying to pray a type of demon or a devil out of him. And then the other one was the son of two pastors who had to go through 6 months of very intensive praying after dinner with his family, quite a humiliating experience, highlighting verses about Sodom and Gomorrah and him being an abomination and that kind of thing. So that was really my story.
And in your story, and I know in Juana's as well, you both anonymized your primary source, the story that you were telling about. How was that conversation with your editors? How did you decide to anonymize, and what discussion did you have with your sources around that issue?
Are you asking me?
Yes, you
I think that my editors understand that there is quite a negative climate for people who are from the community, so it was never anything that they objected to. I gave my sources the option to speak freely and say their names, but then they didn't. There had been an instance where I'd reported on someone before, and he had a lot of backlash, and he wasn't really willing to speak, or if he did speak, he wanted to speak under anonymity, just because Namibia is a very small place. It's only 2.4 million people. Windhoek specifically has just over 300,000 inhabitants. So the community is very small, and if you see someone's name or face in the newspaper, the degrees of separation are really short. So that was something that we do to protect. It wasn't even an issue.
And your editors were fine with it?
My editors were absolutely fine with that.
And same with Juana.
So I think for me, my subject, my source actually works in television as well. So she works in a very, very sort of public space. So it was, it was a given that she had to be anonymous. She actually gave me the pseudonym that she wanted. My editor didn't have a problem with it at all because, of course, as I said, sexuality is criminalized. And so we know the dangers of that, not even just to the source itself, but also to their families, because we've had stories where, somebody gets outed and their families start getting harassed and ostracized in the community. So it's not just, going to be their problem, but it's going to be a very collective issue as well. So it was very important that they were protected.
Ambrose, let's switch to you for a minute. So for your story, you decided to profile some LGBT activists of faith and also some affirming faith leaders in the Ugandan society and Ugandan context. At Kuchu Times, you sort of straddle the role between activism and journalism. Tell us a bit about what Kuchu Times does, or what Kuchu means as well. I'm sure the audience would like to know, and how you decided to focus on that story.
Thank you, Brian. Kuchu Times, Kuchu, the word Kuchu is a slang used by the Ugandan LGBT community to secretly identify themselves from the main public. So when I say you Kuchu, I'm meaning maybe you transgender person, you gay man, you lesbian, that the person next to you might not harm you. So Kuchu Times was formed to counter negative reporting by the mainstream media. At the head of the Anti-Homosexuality Act in 2014, when the president signed the bill, of course in the presence of the international cameras, he called CNN, Al Jazeera, and BBC, CBS, come and in front of your face I show you this is a Western import. I don't want this in Africa. I'm going to enact this law. Yes, really, it was a big blow to the movement. The tabloids got a chance, Every morning you would sleep knowing that if you're either an LGBT activist, your name tomorrow will be printed on with those bad headlines, 100 homos exposed. So it was a terrible moment for the community. Most people fled the country because they were outed. People lost their jobs. People lost their families. They fell off with their families. So we said this can't go on because the suffering was too much. We said much of the focus of advocacy in Uganda was much on health, maybe trying to create this visibility, but there was that media gap. So as activists, we came together and said, let's start a media house that will really bring with a long-term goal of creating attitude change. So we formed Kuchu Times. It's an online media platform, but we also have a print version called Bombastic Magazine. So this is a magazine that since we started working, we have produced so far 3 editions, and each magazine is distributed across the country. And of course, I tell you the work we do is illegal. So the ethics minister is always scaring us. I'm going to arrest everyone doing this work. So to sum it up, you will find much work about Kuchu Times on our website. So how I source this story, this is the everyday work I do. So I have talked to most of these leaders. I've talked to the pastors. I've talked to the associates, the religious leaders who are really supportive of the LGBT people, and everything. So I really wanted to highlight and amplify their voice and show the world that here, how much we have this side of the evangelical movement in Uganda trying to always preach bad messages about LGBT people. We have these faith leaders. Not all people that I documented about were LGBT per se. We have Bishop Christopher Senyonjo. Bishop Christopher Senyonjo was excommunicated from Anglican Church when he openly said, God's love is unconditional, So I talked to those leaders and some LGBT faith leaders. Because most people in our country, most LGBT people no longer go to church. Why? Because whenever they go to church, the same message preached about is you're evil, whatever you're doing is ungodly and everything. So these pastors are trying to create a space where people can reconnect with their faith, you know. So I contacted them, and I went in different districts. I documented the work they do, and they were open to me, you know. So this message, their message was generally the same. God's love is unconditional. Whether you're LGBT, whether you're straight, God's love is unconditional.
It's rare that we see in Western media coverage positive or even affirming coverage of the LGBT community in Uganda. After 2014, a lot of what we've seen is Uganda is the worst place in the world to be queer. How does that shape or how does that jive with your perception and your reality as you see it on a daily basis?
Yeah, it's hard for a person to live queer as a queer person in a country like Uganda, because Section 145 of our Penal Code, a law left behind by the British colonialists, states that carnage against the order of nature is punishable by life in prison. And of course, this bill, the Anti-Homosexuality Act that we petitioned and won in court, was trying to make sure that every advocacy work protecting LGBT persons is going to be criminalized. Maybe if you're having a brothel, maybe hosting LGBT people for a party, if you're having, if you're a parent, I don't report your child to police that he's gay, they're going to arrest you. So it had many clauses. So that bill was generally targeting advocacy, you know, trying to shut down spaces where that LGBT people were trying to create. So the law brings that environment. The media gets the chance to attack people. The evangelicals get the chance to attack people. But I think the Western media has tried to create this notion that Uganda is the worst place to be gay. But yes, it's hard, but there are some achievements the movement has registered. Whenever we have some good stories, they are always left behind, you know, but they always focus on you know, like the negative, you know. So I really want, for example, we have a media house, you know, and how much we are operating illegally, but that's a great achievement. But all this is, whenever someone comes to report, is a pirate journalist wants to cover these breaking stories, but they don't go much down to research much about the successes that we have registered as a movement.
Sally, part of what Done on Record does is to try to tell those positive stories, right? Tell us about your organization and the type of media work you do based in Nairobi.
Right. So I founded None on Record in 2006, actually as a reaction to the murder of a Sierra Leonean activist named Fanny Ann Eddy. And I'm sure a lot of people have her name has been forgotten in time, but she was one of the first lesbians to speak at the UN about the rights of queer Africans, particularly in her home country of Sierra Leone. And when she returned home, she was brutally murdered to the point where her tongue was removed out of her mouth. It was a very symbolic murder to say that she should not be speaking out on these issues. So when she was murdered, this was one of the first times I saw any images of West African lesbians in international news. I was living in Chicago at the time. I'm a Senegalese American lesbian. And so when I did see this article, it had a tremendous impact on me because I felt extremely invisible in my own cultural identities and had no idea that there was a lesbian movement or a queer movement happening in West Africa at that time. And this woman had been doing all of this work, and she had been so brutally murdered and silenced. So the next steps were to sort of think about, well, we have these identities, and where are they? Who are these people living these lives? And so began to collect oral histories, travel throughout the US, North America, and eventually to Africa, which led me to open the office in Nairobi in 2011, because a lot of the work that we were doing was being only published on NPR or BBC, but we weren't having great impact in terms of shifting the narrative on the continent and the places where we were collecting these stories, and a lot of activists were working. So when we opened the office in 2011, the None on Record office in Nairobi, we began to work with LGBT activist organizations, grassroots organizations, to build their media capacity. So we're teaching people how to document human rights abuses using digital tools, how to keep their files safe, how to also approach journalists, how to also vet journalists to make sure that you can trust them. And then this work has sort of changed. In 2006, we didn't have the social media outlets that we have now. But now we are in a space where we need to think about how can we talk outside of our own communities? How can we reach larger African audiences? And how can we do that when we don't have access to distribution platforms like TV, radio, or newspapers because of the laws that exist in our countries? So I think, I know we're talking about Uganda. Uganda also, and also in place in Kenya, our civil society is shrinking. No matter if you are LGBT, if you are a woman, if you are a poor person, if you are a person living with HIV, you have less access to the civil society to organize, to hold your governments accountable. So it's compounded by these things where we are LGBT, but we also live in environments where we don't have, we don't have the right to speak out. So let's stop there for now.
Working with activists, what are some of the biggest media safety issues you face, and how do you navigate those?
Because we are an LGBT media organization, and because of the nature of how journalists have treated LGBT people and how they've been reported, we don't have a lot of issues with people trusting us with their story. People generally do trust us with their stories, but that's also because we respect these stories. But I think as more visibility has come on the movement, it's sort of supporting activists to learn how to deal with journalists, how to vet them, who you can trust, how to do your due diligence. These are really important things that activists are starting to understand because so many people have been burned by very bad reporting. And also just knowing, working with journalists, that every journalist isn't necessarily trying to write a bad story, but they also have editors that will take a perfectly objective story and then rewrite this story and make it sensational and publish it, and the actual journalist has no rights or say in what happens next. So there are a lot of challenges in terms of this, and there's not a lot of accountability. Like, we don't have a GLAD or anything like that. There's not a lot of accountability in terms of if these stories are published, then what? They just sell a bunch of papers, make the environment incredibly unsafe, but we don't have the ability to hold them accountable in the systems in which we live in currently.
Eric, Mark mentioned in his introduction the need for creating an enabling environment, so the fact that NED does this. How does NED do this kind of work, and how does NED approach some of the issues we've been discussing so far?
I think that over time, over the past 7 or 8 years, I think you touched on it. Part of it is the enabling space. I think in some of the ways we engage is the overall sense that minority communities of all types, LGBTQ plus communities, are part of communities that are under pressure. And so it's an overall civil society approach that we take. We receive projects from people who have ideas, and we support people's ideas. And in a variety of cases, we've supported projects that are very directly focused on LGBT activities. In other cases, we've focused on supporting projects that are coming at it from a health rights angle. We're looking at people, human rights defenders, people who are looking for protection, who have been under attack. We're looking at, like I said, civic space, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly. And so there is no one size fits all in terms of the projects. And I will emphasize that the endowment for all of its projects waits to receive an idea from people. And so I will say we don't get a lot of LGBT projects. I'm surprised we don't get more, but I would say we have supported quite a few over the years.
And I know you're mostly on the NED side, so I don't want you to speak out of turn, but in terms of what SEMA does, in terms of media assistance on these issues, can you give us some examples of interventions where journalists have been in danger or there's been safety issues where SEMA's intervened?
Well, I think I probably can't speak to that too directly.
Maybe during the Q&A.
I think that's probably a better way to do it. But I will say that it is part of, again, that broader access to space, the ability of people to express their ideas. And SEMA is always looking for platforms. They're looking for ideas on how we can support, not just financially, but with making connections with other people.
A lot of what we're talking now with religion and LGBT issues are taboo topics, but I'd be interested in knowing from everyone what some other taboos are in your countries in terms of reporting, what some of the red lines are when you're trying to do your work as a journalist. Whoever wants to take that question or start, I'm sure everyone's got examples.
I mean, I think, I was in Nigeria, most of the media, especially print media, is privately owned, so it's very much thrives on advertising revenue. We also, of course, have an issue. You can't deny the issue with brown paper envelope journalism, which is basically, money put in brown paper envelope and given to journalists. So there are a lot of stories that should make it into newspapers or should be reported about that don't get reported about as a result of that. A lot of people who own some of these newspapers also have political connections as well. So corruption can be difficult to report about. Religion, LGBT, so I think everything has its own red tape to a certain degree.
It seems to be a lot of economic issues.
Yes, very exactly. So, and stories that you'd probably consider important will be relegated to the back pages or not even reported at all as a result.
Martha, I know Namibia has quite a strong press freedom, broadly speaking, relatively speaking.
In Namibia is number one for press freedom in Africa and 24 in the world, according to the World Press Freedom Index by Reporters Without Borders. So the press is pretty free, but people, exactly as Warner said, newspapers, independent newspapers and state-owned newspapers rely on advertising. So there is an element of self-censorship. People won't pursue stories that they see that the government is not aligned with or endorsing because they don't want to miss out on their advertising and their institutions' advertising. There was actually a case with the Namibian, which is a prominent paper in Namibia, a daily newspaper. It's been going since 1985. It's quite an activist paper. It was anti-apartheid and very respected in terms of its opinion and what it puts out. It can be very critical of the government at times, and from 2001, the government actually banned their institutions from advertising in the Namibian. I think it was for 10 or 11 years. And that, didn't affect what the Namibian reports on, but that is something that people who rely on advertising or organizations and media that relies on advertising would definitely consider. So there's an element of self-censorship for sure.
Ambrose, we were talking last night about how it's difficult to report on some families in Uganda. Explain that, but also the broader constraints.
Yeah, in Uganda, when you're talking, for example, stories about the first family, that's the family of President Museveni and the wife, or their sons and daughters, you have to be cautious. You risk losing your press license. So you have to be cautious that by the angle you are trying to use. But more so, we have seen in many cases media houses being closed because, for example, Daily Monitor, KFM, Red Pepper, because maybe you wrote a story that you went beyond the limits. So the Uganda Communications Commissioner has a very big, they have a very big mandate and very big responsibility to close your media house once you report a story that to the government, maybe you're trying to attack them. However much you're trying to bring out the truth and the reality, you risk losing your license. They might first suspend you, then to regain it, you have to be fined a lot of money. More so stories of LGBT. Now this is for the mainstream media houses. Live around which times we are specifically for us, we say we dedicated our life for LGBT, trying to give LGBT a space because most of the mainstream media has been used as a tool to attack the movement. Some media houses have in their code of conduct, in their guidelines, they have something clear. They would say, no story concerning LGBT issues should be published. For example, I give an example of New Vision, which is a government-owned newspaper. You don't talk anything concerning LGBT issues. Even if it's something trying to maybe to sensitize the nation, they will either say, we don't want your story to run here because you are putting our company at danger. So it goes around that angle.
So in the countries that you work in, how do you do you confront issues where journalists aren't allowed to report on these issues, and how do you get around that?
In terms of LGBT issues?
You're trying to connect activists with journalists, but if a journalist isn't able to report?
Well, let me talk about Kenya first, where we're based. Kenya is a bit different in the sense that people do talk about LGBT issues. There's a lot of human interest stories about LGBT issues. Benyo Vango, Wainaina can go on morning talk show and talk about coming out. There, articles have been written that are balanced. And then on the flip side, there's a lot of sensationalism. So it's a balanced sort of space. maybe not 50-50, but there's a lot that can happen. I think, though, that social media has really changed journalism in Kenya. So I'll speak broadly in terms of the most recent election that we just had in Kenya. And of course, every time there's a presidential election, there's a lot of stress that we're going to have what happened in 2007 happen again. So there was a media blackout basically for the week or the few days after the election. And what ended up happening as police officers and government troops were storming oppositional people's homes and killing people, and things were happening out in other towns outside of Nairobi, people started using their phones and putting that on Twitter or putting it on Facebook. So there was documentation of the violence that was being not reported by the media. So because of this, because Kenya is now more connected than it has ever been in terms of internet, things are exposed. I think in Kenya, the culture is obsessed with talking about corruption, and there's a lot of corruption, but people talk about it. So it's never that it can't be talked about. It may not be always talked about in mainstream journalism in the same way, but I have always seen that people do report. In this particular instance, with the election, the media houses were very quiet, and that was government pressure. So.
And then the other countries where you work?
It really depends. I mean, Africa is quite large. So Senegal, of course, we cannot talk about LGBT issues in media. Some of the papers there are state-run. I'm not sure as many as there used to be. But the rhetoric around LGBT issues is quite violent. And we don't have space to have even, meetings are very difficult to do there. They still happen, but they're difficult. Art exhibits have been closed down in the past. I've talked about LGBT issues. So it's a difficult space. I know Wana can talk about Nigeria. Nigeria has a very robust LGBT organizing community, and they talk about things, even though it has one of the most oppressive anti-LGBT laws, on the continent. So I think it just really depends on where you are. And it's, I think, 52 countries on the continent.
54.
54, sorry. Oops, my bad. So it's just a very big and diverse place. Yeah.
I'd love to hear your perspective actually on that. But also, we went to the museum yesterday, and I was disappointed. They have a whole display of newspapers from around the world. They didn't have any from Nigeria.
No.
And our wonderful tour guide.
I was very disappointed myself.
Our wonderful tour guide said that was because they just didn't have a relationship with a
media.
Nigerian paper that was willing to do it. But Nigeria is such a large population on the continent.
Absolutely.
Tell us about some of this work that's happening.
So in terms of
the activism tiers.
I mean, there is a robust activism space going on there, but it's again it's buried under health and human rights, because that's pretty much the only way it can really function. But there are a lot of people who are very bold, who are really bold within that sort of space of human rights. They're very vocal about the fact that they specialize in LGBT rights-related work. There's an organization called TARES, which is the Initiative for Equal Rights. And so they're really trying to do a lot of beyond they started off doing a lot of healthcare advocacy within the LGBTQ community, but they've become really vocal in terms of normalization. So they have like a TV series, so just a fictional TV show, but it's on YouTube, so you can't put it on Nigerian television. So it's on YouTube, and it also has storylines on LGBT storylines involved in that as well. They had a short film called Hell or High Water, which they produced as well. I think they're now actually producing a book, turning a novel. There's a novel about LGBT story, which they're turning into a movie as well, which they're currently producing. So I know that they're very, very sort of vocal and very about that as well. But something about LGBT stories and just LGBT as a community in general in Nigeria is that it's very intertwined with class. So I think a lot of the time people don't understand how sort of class is a big layered factor into it as well. The example I will use is, so for instance, because of the homophobic rhetoric and the Same-Sex Prohibition Act as well, we've had a lot of police arbitrarily arresting young men, mostly young men, and really harassing them, lots of extortion going on, lots of blackmail going on. And what they do is pretty much they just see a young man walking on the streets, and based on his perceived sexuality, so example, he's wearing a pair of skinny jeans, and maybe he has his hair colored, and he looks, really quirky and funky, and he gets arrested. and he gets really harassed at the police station, and there's a lot of money that's extorted. You know, there's blackmail. They'll out him to his family. They go through their phones as well. So I've actually heard from a couple of gay men who say every morning when they wake up, they have to delete messages off their phones, because if they get arrested, they go through their phones to see if there are any photographs, any conversations between them and other men as well. So these are all sort of the interesting loopholes that happen. But the reason I talk about class is that this is only going to happen with a young man who is probably walking on the streets in a certain type of area. If a man in his skinny jeans and the same type of hair is in an SUV, no policeman is going to stop him or arrest him. So there's all these sort of layers about with class. And so it brings me to that thing in Nigeria where we say sometimes that your crime is not being gay, but your crime is being poor.
Ambrose, we see a lot of that media harassment and also media harassment in Uganda. One example that some people in the room might have seen was the cover of the local Rolling Stone magazine, which no longer exists. Not the Rolling Stone that we know of as a music magazine, but a local one that had a cover that said 100 gays, hang them, this sort of thing. Talk about media coverage around the recent Pride events that happened. So last year's, which was rated, and then this year's, which was cancelled.
Yeah, we initiated Pride. We have had Pride since 2012, but for the past years, we have been having it very well peacefully. But I'm not meaning the pride of walking on the streets of Washington, D.C. very free and, you know, with pride flags. No. This is an event we took outside of the city on the beaches on the shores of Lake Victoria, because you can't move openly on the streets of Kampala. You know, people will stone you. They will say, "No, what is this?" So we have been having Pride very successfully, but 2016 and a very, very, very traumatizing night was evidenced that day. We were having Mr. and Mr. Pride beauty contest, and I was on my camera because my work on Kuchu Times is to be there to document what is happening. So all of a sudden, police bumped in. You know, these guys and put everyone on gunpoint down. You know. We were surrounded, we had international coverage, you know, all the journalists we are all they told us, go down. And it was sad, whatever I saw that night, the police trying to, they were pulling wigs of transgender women, trying to find out if these are men or women. It was sad. Then out of a sudden, this young guy was scared, because people were scared. Maybe the guy was staying with his uncle, and his uncle was an army general, you know, one of the guys of the president. So this young man had never been out to his uncle. So that he in his mind he thought, oh my God, I'm going to be shown on TV, tomorrow I'll be in the papers. So I'm dead. The event was being held on a rooftop. It was on the 5th floor. The guy jumped from the 5th floor and fell down. He broke his backbone. It was sad. Actually, he's now lame. He's just trying to. He underwent some therapy and everything, but it was bad. What I saw even that. So at home, police works closely with the media. Police comes, maybe raid someone's home, then they have already made contacts with the media. So you just see the cameras on your door. Then the next day you're on TV and everything, so people have really faced that problem. But the media has really been a tool used to suppress and really give hard time to LGBT people. Red paper, like as I told you that moment when they used to out people and everything, landlords, we are evicting people unlawfully. You know, someone says, no, I can't house a homosexual. You saw you're on the first out of my house, you know, and of course you will not have where to report. When you go to police, it's the same case, extortion. Then of course it's illegal. So the media really has been used as a tool to attack the movement a lot.
Martha, Namibia just had its first Pride in many years, you said. How was local coverage of that?
Not first Pride in many years. We had another Pride in 2015 in Swakopmund. I think that was the first one in
The
quite a
Windhoek,
few
right?
years. And then we had Windhoek Pride. We actually had, it was called We Are One Advocacy Week, and it was a whole week of events like educating the public about LGBT issues at various venues, screening relevant movies, and then a final parade and party and a lip sync battle and that kind of thing. Response from the public varied due to framing. So the Namibian, which again is pretty liberal, was pro-LGBT, happy that there was a pride, proud that there was a pride, and sort of had like a photo page and captions from people and activists, whereas other media was less positive and actually did vox pops from mostly people who were homophobic. The rhetoric was very religion-centric. Adam and Steve, God created you as a man or a woman, you can't change. Very hateful in line with religion, and with very few voices from the actual community. So it really depends on who is reporting. I must give Namibia credit because we have some fantastic organizations out there like Outright Namibia, Positive Vibes, Tuli Nam, who engages the religious leaders, actually has been working on that for a number of years, starting those conversations because faith is so important to Namibians. So meeting with pastors and the bishop and saying, how can we find common ground? How can we accommodate people from the community and the churches? And then also Wings to Transcend, which is a new organization which deals with transgender issues. So as the movement grows, and it definitely is like a movement in support of the LGBT community, the media picks up a lot more stories. There's more conversation. Before I came to the States, I went to a media breakfast where these organizations organized to meet people from the various media and educated us on the terms and the pronouns, kind of what I did on a very small scale in Cape Town. So the conversations are definitely starting, and as more events happen, the media has to decide how they're going to report. There is also a bit of a disconnect, I think, between the younger journalists and the older editors, because the younger journalists we are educated, not that they're not educated, but we're educated in a more liberal way, and we have open minds, we have the internet, we have whatever, we're just a little bit more liberal. So you'll have an instance where you'll write a story and you'll get everything right, you won't dead name, you'll use the correct pronouns, then it'll go through editorial and they will dead name a transgender person, and you'll only see that on the page. So you need to keep a keen eye on your stories from submission to actually seeing it on the page and print and layouts. So I think between the older and the newer newsrooms, there is a little bit of an issue, but the conversations are happening, and that's important. And you are seeing people who are completely hateful, like in Facebook comments under the articles, and then people who are not necessarily from the community, but are defending the community. So props to the organizations and props for them to engaging with the media, because it's happening in Namibia, at least.
The point about editors changing stories, we see all the time. And we, with our workshops, we always try to include some editors because we realize that that's a key part of accurate coverage. Editors, publishers, journalists themselves. This year as well, we're doing another workshop in Cape Town in November. And we're still in sort of the scoping stage. So we're trying to bring in as many new countries that weren't represented last year as possible. And one of the ways that's been very helpful for us to make some of those connections was at the SEMA, the Durban consultation we went to, where there were journalists from a lot of countries that we personally haven't engaged with in the past that gave us very good suggestions from South Sudan, Togo, Ethiopia, Tanzania. Can you talk a bit, or would you like to talk a bit about what the point of that consultation was and what some of the outcomes were and how you're going to use it moving forward? Just describe what we were doing there.
I think that the point of the consultation was, it was not focused on the LGBT community, but it was taking a look at how do you get other actors involved in recognizing the importance of independent media. So often we're talking in an echo chamber. No matter what sector you're working in, you're talking about your issue, you're focusing on this. And we think that for independent media to thrive, other people have to recognize, other sectors on the continent have to recognize their enlightened self-interest. So we're looking at the business community, we're looking at policymakers and governments, we're looking at bringing in editors, not just talking to rank and file journalists, but people who are decision makers, people who understand that having this broad enabling environment has a positive impact in a whole set of cascading ways that we're not even haven't been clearly identified, but having this type of meeting is critical to moving forward on that. It was the third in the series so far. The first took place in Latin America and then Asia, and there'll be more in the future.
One of the issues we encountered there and that we always encounter in our work is working in different languages. And I wanted to ask, what is local language coverage of some of the issues we're talking about? I think a lot of us here, we look specifically at English language media, but often the way that LGBT issues, religion issues are reported on in different languages can be different and also sometimes more incendiary, but English language, French language aren't picking up on it. How do you see some of that coverage if you're covering local language coverage of the topics? Is it different from the English language coverage?
Yeah, actually, let me go first on that. For example, when I talk of this magazine, we get feedback. People call us and say, I read this and everything. Maybe I didn't know my son was like this. But we see we leave out a certain group of people, What about those who don't know English, So we have had calls, people saying, can you send us maybe translated copies of Bombastic, because maybe we don't know how to read English, but we'd really love to have these in our languages. But all this goes back to the cost related, Sometimes you're working in a limited budget, and so translating this into, like, Uganda has over 30 languages, so it's really something that goes hand in hand with cost. But even issues of like the local language, people actually consume, for example, papers in Uganda, which is the most spoken language in central Uganda, they are really bought very, very much. The sales are always high because that's the percentage, most of the people, maybe they didn't go to school and everything. So this is reaching the few elites, but then we leave out that group. Maybe in the local areas who can't access maybe internet and who can't read English. Yeah.
Perspectives from other countries?
Nigeria has about over 300 languages, so I can't really speak in terms of local dialect media. But the stories I've heard on sort of Yoruba radio, they're mostly very sort of freak story based.
Sorry?
They're freak story based. So they make them sound like these like weird, freaky stories. Yes, sensational like freak stories that I've heard on sort of like Yoruba radio. But beyond that, there's not very much. I don't think there's very much of that going on. No.
Sally, any perspectives from your work? Do you work exclusively in English at None on Record?
No, we don't. However, we're working on a new project where we are profiling allies, collaboration with the UN. And one of these strategies for this particular project is to think about how to have messengers from communities telling these stories in their local language. So, for example, if it's in Kenya, also Kenya has many, many languages, but Swahili would be, the main language, that if there's a mother talking about accepting their daughter, that she would do the message in Swahili. But then there's also a lot of strategic pushback around these things because, frankly, English is the lingua franca. Like the major papers are written in English. Mm-hmm. If we are thinking about how this particular story can translate and also be shared in Uganda or other places in East Africa, then there's more of an argument to put it in English and then subtitle it. So that's always one of the biggest challenges in this particular work, and particularly in the advocacy work that I do, because it's not just English or the local languages, it's also French, it's Portuguese, it's like all of these different things, and how do we cover all of this and try to include it and not leave out the French-speaking part of the continent in the work that we do. So it is a tremendous challenge, and I think Ambrose talked a lot about resources. Resources are also a huge part of why we sometimes can do the majority of our work in English, to be frank. So yeah, I think it's something that we have to really work on.
I think there's a lot of journalists in the room, a lot of us work in the media space. I'd love to get your perspectives on US coverage of Africa. Martha, you've written for a publication called Africa is a Country. Talk about why that publication exists why it's named that, but also what your thoughts are on what you often see covered about Namibia, and then maybe Southern Africa, the continent as a whole.
Okay, Africa as a country is called Africa as a country because people think Africa is a country. But actually it is, as Sally said, it's 54 different countries. And I always say that, you know, people sort of blanket Africans as, you know, black Africans, but Africa is diverse. It has 54 countries with their own triumphs and their own challenges and their own languages. Between South Africa and Namibia, there is the Orange River, and you go on to the one side of it, and it's 11 languages that don't have too much to do with each other, and another 13 or whatever the numbers are, and it really is just diverse. And I don't think that coverage of Africa, which is not a country, you know, reflects that diversity. And I think that people, even when you say diversity in Africa, people are kind of like, what are you talking about? It's black people. They all sort of have the same experience, and that experience, according to the media, international media, is one of poverty and hardship, and you know what the cliches are.
Right.
So that's why Africa it's kind of a play on what the perception is. Sorry, what was the second question?
Well, Namibia specifically, we don't often see much coverage
Yeah.
of Namibia. What do you see in international media?
Namibia, does anyone know where Namibia is? Like a hands situation. That's like not even half the room. So
Some shy
you know,
folks
you don't
maybe.
see
Give them the benefit
too
of the
much.
doubt.
Namibia's been in the news recently because the government is trying to get Namibia is an ex-German colony, so there is talk about reparations and admitting that the extermination orders for the Herero and Nama people in the 1900s was actually the first genocide. So that's been in the news quite a bit. But otherwise, Namibia, I've seen articles, again, poverty, the disparity between rich and poor, we have it's quite extreme. We have admirable conservation laws, so I've seen that kind of thing. Yeah, but wildlife, poverty, and then, you know, just kind of lumping us with whatever's happening if, you know, we exist. So that's my experience of Namibian coverage.
Other perspectives on the coverage, or if Martha's adequately summed it up, what do you think international journalists could do better in covering your country or the continent or the region as a whole?
I think I would say for my country, it's sort of two ends of the spectrum. You either have the poverty porn type situation, which is always about all the terrible things that are happening, or the insurgency in the north of the country, the disappearance of the Chibok girls, those sorts of stories. Or on the other end, it's usually like Africa Rising, and Nigeria is at the heart of Africa Rising, but these people are so excessive. And so it's now this sort of wasteful type of characters in the stories who are just living in large mansions and, you know, squandering lots of money and how Nigerians are like the largest consumers of champagne in Africa, that sort of thing. I think what needs to now be considered is, in terms of if I'm offering like solutions, is the complexities within Nigeria as a country, if I'm going to speak on Nigeria specifically, sort of the complexity. So looking at even reporting about, say, religion or insurgency, there are very, very deep sort of political layers to that. You know, when people are talking about like Christian versus Muslim, again, there's politics involved in those sort of things. When you're looking at, you know, when you're looking at something like LGBT, there's class related to those sort of things as well. The cultural layers as well, in terms of how it is that people perceive things as well. So I think a lot of cultural layers, a lot of geographical complexities need to be understood and need to be sort of researched and sort of excavated in terms of trying to report about the region as well.
Anything our other
And even
panelists-
understanding the history as well.
Yeah. Anything our other panelists would like to add on
Yeah, for me, my
improving
country,
coverage?
of course, always about Joseph Kony.
Joseph Kony.
Yeah, and of course, by the end of recent, we have seen some good reporting. Uganda being one of the most refugee-coming countries, people from Somalia, we have Eritreans and everything. So, but otherwise, it's the same as Martha says, poverty and everything, but it's the same.
And also pretty
perspective.
superficial reporting, like Juana was saying. There's often so little context, and you know, people who haven't really been embedded, or there are so few voices actually from within the communities that we live in and the communities being discussed. So I think the reporting that I've seen, whether it's Namibia or whatever, I'm always like, well, you know, things that I think of are it's not very in depth.
I'm also wondering if, if a lot of journalists, foreign journalists that come into Nigeria work enough with local journalists to create these stories.
Yeah.
So beyond just like working with the fixer and saying, just lead me to this person or hook me up with this person, but actually working with people to understand the context of what it is they're trying to create. Because oftentimes there's a sense that the story is already pre-written before you get there, and all you're doing is just getting quotes to fill up the rest of the story.
Right. And I wanted to add to what Rana is saying. It's also that even, being in Nairobi, which is a huge hub for a lot of the major newspapers and radio and TV around the world, a lot of the journalists who even live there do not interact with the people in the country. So there are these distant expat communities of journalists that only interact with each other, and their major interaction is with their house help or their driver.
Yeah.
And that's a huge problem. And also being an expat in Kenya, it's something that I see all the time. So it's just, this is what's influencing these stories.
In talking with the broader civil society in our work, we've heard people saying that perhaps it's incumbent on us to actually be the people to push the stories out. And maybe not writing the stories yourselves, but to say, hey, by the way, I've got a little bit of information here. You might be interested to come in and follow up on it. At the endowment, what we do in our annual report is we're asked across our program teams to say, hey guys, we've got a lot of projects we're supporting. Why don't you pull out a few highlights? Why don't you identify some things, write a little snippet about it, and give it to us so we can use that in our major publication, but we can also use it when we're going around and talking about our work in general. So we have to sometimes push the content out. And so I see some of our partners taking the initiative to reach out, whether it's across the ocean or reach out to major media houses and say, hey, by the way, there's a really good story happening down here where people are doing this, and maybe you want to come in and we can get you started on the story and you can pursue it from there.
Interesting. Ambrose, you also work as a fixer. So you don't name names, but you see people come and,
Yeah, don't name names.
you help them.
Yeah.
How would you say that interaction is and that coverage? And then we're going to open the floor to questions.
I think really journalists from maybe Europe or America, they are really now trying to say that maybe I'm coming this place. Yes, I have this story, but there are people on the ground, Maybe Ambrose, because usually help fixers who are coming specifically to cover stories of LGBT stories, maybe. But in the past, people would just come, rush, and they just go and go with a proper research story. But now we got the ground, we make sure that someone goes back with the real factual evidence, not just to publish a story and brings it backfires, Yeah.
Okay, let's start taking questions from the audience. There's a microphone with Kate. I don't know if you want to pass it around.
One in the back also.
Oh yeah, and there's a microphone in the back as well. Just raise your hand high. Let's start here and then go to Patrick to start. And please, if you don't mind, please say your name and who you work with.
Hello. My name is Rachel Robinson. I'm a professor at American University here in DC. And I'm working with two colleagues, Tara McKay and Nicole Ngati, on a project which we're broadly describing as trying to explain the rise of politicized homophobia across African countries. So thus far, we've written two papers. One looks at the discourse actually from media sources around LGBTI plus communities in Nigeria, Uganda, and Malawi. And that's in qualitative sociology. And then another one that's coming out in the sociology of development looks at, essentially, it looks at Senegal and Malawi and shows that ultimately the backlash against gays that occurred there was connected unintentionally to HIV intervention. So HIV interventions increased visibility, which then in turn had there were good things associated with it, but had negative outcomes. So I just wanted to, I guess I have two observations from that and then some questions that relate to what we've talked about today. So one thing we've noticed, we've done field work in all of these countries, and one thing we've noticed in talking with different civil society organizations is language barriers, but in particular it's French, English, Portuguese, English, and so we're trying to think of ways that we can help bridge some of those. So I'd be curious to know about your ideas. The other divide we've noticed is actually between the health and human rights groups. So those that have gotten a lot of HIV money are often not so concerned with promoting broader rights. And so there are other groups then that distance themselves from that. But then so the two questions are, one, how can we help the media unsensationalize writing about these issues? So in Nigeria, everybody said, yes, the media is one of our main problems. So, pedophilia is, equated with homosexuality. So how do you undo something like that? And then the other question is, as academics, what could we do better to support activism and media? So here's some of the skills we have. So we can do data analysis, for example. We'd also like to figure out ways to help NGOs and civil society organizations become self-sufficient so that they don't have to spend all their time writing grants. But we're looking for ways to collaborate, ways to help organizations across countries come together. And so thank you for all of that you've shared today.
Anyone want to, I'll say yes, please, to the second part. Anyone want to respond to the questions?
I think we are moving a step forward. We have projects like at Coach Times. In our strategic plan, we are trying to bring the mainstream media closer. We want to reach their newsrooms. And have projects that are maybe trying to tell them the reality. And maybe even when we produce these magazines, we take them to every radio station, every TV station, every newspaper. Red paper itself that always used to out people. We take these copies to red paper, How much, of course, the red paper will come out with the funny headline, maybe homos produce a magazine, but they will have gotten the magazine. So we are trying to make them really understand and try to reach out them and show that this is the reality.
I'll probably speak on the subject of, you talked about how the media is a problem as well. I really think sort of creates, because I know Martha talked about the fact that a lot of editors are much older and you can't extract, unfortunately, as much as journalism should be independent, and of course we know the journalist is supposed to be open-minded, but the reality is you can't extract the journalists from the space in which they've been born and raised and that ideology in itself. So I think a sort of raising of a new sort of generation or a group of journalists who are going to give sort of counter narratives, I think is important. And the question is now how to infuse that into mainstream media. So I would say, for example, the Nigerian Guardian is a really progressive, forward thinking paper. And they're very inclusive and very interested in hearing multiple voices. So I know, like the executive director of Tears that I talked about, he actually has a column in the paper where he speaks on issues on sexuality and gender minorities as well. So I think something like that, having that in, having at least a dedicated columnist in each paper would be something that I think will be a great way to have a dedicated page to this. So you're not interfering with all the editor messing with the other stories, because at least you have this one thing that is there. It might not be enough, but I feel like it's a great way to start sort of penetrating mainstream newspapers, because there's a lot of conversation online. I think online, I feel like online we're great. There's a lot of conversation, there's debates as well, anti-pro arguments going on, but and you're seeing different sort of attitudinal changes via the internet when you read a lot of comment sections of articles and stories and things like that. You have people actually fighting people in the comment section now, so which is really interesting, because some time ago it would have been just very one-sided, but now you have people countering each other, throwing Bible passages at each other as well in the comment section. So, but I think the question now is, how do we sort of have these voices also in mainstream publications? And I think there needs to be a deliberate effort to infuse that in there.
Let's take two questions now. So Patrick, and then the gentleman in the brown jackets.
Thanks. I'm Patrick Butler with the International Center for Journalists here in Washington. We've seen a lot of coverage in the media here about U.S. evangelical groups influencing the votes in many of your countries, promoting anti-LGBT laws. And I'm just curious whether that story gets covered in African media, especially given that many of your leaders, complain that they don't want outside interference from U.S. and European governments and NGOs to promote tolerance. But according to the stories we've seen here, there is a lot of interference coming from outside going the other way. So I'm curious whether that story gets covered in Africa. And then just a quick question for, is it Muna? Wana, sorry. In Nigeria, I think you said at the beginning that your story got published in The Guardian UK.
Yes.
And I'm just curious whether it also got published in Nigerian media, and if not, why not, and could it have been? And then maybe for Brian, whether you have that problem with other journalists in the program that they're not able to get their stories published.
Sure. And then let's take a question from the gentleman from Internews, I believe.
Ahmed Imam from Internews. And just want first to thank Saima for having this very important meeting, which I think is the idea itself is very good. And because I'm coming from a background from Egypt, this topic also we can talk about it either in Egypt or in the whole Middle East because of religion reasons. So my suggestion, I think there is two problems for this. One is education. I don't know if you can SEMA or NED or whoever can have a program for education starting from school or university to, because the idea itself, it is always LGBT means the sex for anybody. Actually, I am a journalist for 35 years in Egypt. When I came here last year, I have no idea what this word mean. I have to go on dictionary and see what this mean. I asked other people, I didn't know what it is. So I think it is major problem is education. People don't know what is. And my suggestion also to work with the editors, because if you start working, as you said, with young people, young reporters, and then he take the story to the editors, he just say, are you crazy? Just throw it away. I am suggesting on NED or SEMA to have a program, exchange program, bring editors-in-chief or some of the senior editors to visit places and have this story as part of health, human rights, different aspects. It doesn't have to be only sex or LGBT. It has to be part of a major all story so they can accept this. Because I think as a coming from a Middle East background, even for me it is very difficult unless because I didn't know what it means. So first you have to explain to me what you're talking about, and then you can have a good reporting on this story. Thank you very much.
Yeah. A lot of what we do at Religion News Foundation with this is exactly what you're saying, and then that's what we hope this reporting guide helps other journalists do. So do go ahead and take a look at this online. And through our 4-day workshops, but also we've recently been doing more one-day engagements in Zimbabwe and a few other places. We're trying to do just what you say. And Celia's trying to do similar work at None on Record, I know. So she might want to speak a bit about that. But let's go to Patrick's questions around how is the influence of US evangelical groups being covered in African media? And then if Wano wants to talk about this specific thing. But let's go first to that first question. How's that being covered?
Okay.
The role of Scott Lively, Stephen Anderson, these types of characters.
Yeah, I think Ambrose and I will have slightly different answers, because I know in Uganda it's been a lot of activist-driven forcing media to talk about it. In particular, God Loves Uganda was actually an idea pitched from David Kato to Roger Ross Williams. So it was something that the activists themselves, and God Loves Uganda was a film about the US evangelicals' influence on the anti-homosexuality bill in Uganda. So I know that a lot of the activists saw this very early on and then approached the media and tried to get as many people as possible to talk about it. I know at Kuchu Times and Bombastic, you guys have talked about it at length, but you can go into that more in detail. But in terms of Kenya, or in lots of other places, this is such an obvious connection that isn't discussed in such a clear way. And it's because we live in very religious societies. So, and also it's just that the US church comes with a lot of money and a lot of resources. So they're able to influence how this conversation is happening. So there hasn't been that sort of level of critique by the major papers to say, homosexuality is actually, or our anti-homosexuality laws are a byproduct of our colonial past. Like, that's very rarely discussed and reported on. It's just that our homophobia and our laws are here to protect our African cultural identities, because all of this is un-African, when in actuality, as Wana said earlier, this homophobia and the way we practice this homophobia was brought to us, and the way that our legal frameworks are that sort of criminalizes homophobia was actually brought to us as well. And now we have adopted it as our own, situation. So that also impacts how the media does report on it in different countries. Now, it might be different in South Africa, maybe Namibia, I'm not sure, where you guys have a lot of religious folks, but I mean churches and things like that. But in Kenya, it doesn't happen in that way.
An interesting example, Stephen Anderson, a pastor from the US, tried to go to South Africa, Botswana, Malawi in late last year and was denied from South Africa, I think kicked out of Botswana based on hate speech issues.
Which is amazing. That's a fantastic, things are definitely changing in different regions,
Did you want to add?
Really the influence of evangelicals, especially the work of Live and Group Reads has really been, when you consider it on the ground in Uganda, the impact they left behind. For example, when Scott Lively came, before he came, yes, the debate was there, but he came and he brought these parents together, he brought these pastors together. He influenced them with this gospel, saying maybe these gay people are after your children. They are after your children. We want to recruit your children to homosexuality, so they are deadly. You shouldn't allow them to be here, So, and of course, that gave birth to the anti-gay bill. They started drafting so you can see there is the great connectivity between the politicians and the evangelicals, So, over time, we have seen still like Scott Lively, we see Smug Sexual Minorities Uganda sued Scott Lively in here in America, but again he won the case, but then they warned him not again spread his message of hate. But still the pastors there, they're still going on, they still do that. Semper and company, but of course when the bill was annulled, they somehow slowed down. But even if they are not so vocal, doesn't mean they are not. They are planning. Maybe they are coming back with something different. But also the media has given them much platform. They have given them much space. They give them much airtime. They give them all the time they need. But they can't host one gay person to come and explain about maybe the work they are doing, about maybe this is something in born. It's not an it's not imported as you say. So they are really much favored by the media.
Okay. Juana, to respond. First of all, one of our journalists did publish in Nigeria, Anthony.
Yes, Anthony published in the Tell newspaper. Yes, it would have the Nigerian Guardian would definitely have published the article. I don't know about the other papers. They would have probably published, but maybe sensationalized certain things. It was just a function of who accepted the story first. That's why it got published there. And also, the UK Guardian had a sort of global audience, and they have a very large Nigerian readership as well. And so I thought that was very important to be in that kind of space. I think what you guys were talking about, something Nigerian with Nigerians and sort of sexuality conversations, they also still view it as a distraction from really bigger political issues. So even when the anti-homosexuality bill was passed, the conversation was that the government is using this as a distraction from dealing with much bigger issues that are happening in the country. And so every time these kind of conversations come up again, it's sensationalized, but it dies down so quickly because it's like, this is so not relevant to us that for a lot of conversations that I see and I hear and I read about, that happens. So, and I think that also affects the amount of coverage that it gets. So people are not even aware of the amount of violence that exists because to them, it's not as important as the bigger things that are happening, like the fact that the president has been out of the country for how many months, and he's sick and we don't really know what's going on. So yeah, all of those sorts of things.
It's often used as a scapegoat,
yes,
especially around elections or in times of heightened.
Exactly.
Let's take a couple more questions, and then if anyone wants to keep responding to the previous ones, you're welcome to. Let's go here, and then let's go all the way in the back. Nick, and then the gentleman to the right. We'll take 3 questions if we can keep track. I'll try.
Jennifer Watley from World Learning. I've actually got a couple of questions. One is that you touched upon the idea that LGBT issues are seen as a sort of a Western imposition. They're not Are there traditions or from within the countries you're working in that you can point to show or to demonstrate that it is not a Western imposition, that it is something that's found in societies? And then my second question is, the LGBT communities that you're working in, are you seeing potential for linkages outside the LGBT community? You mentioned that you're working on a piece about allies, and I wonder to what extent the LGBT groups are, finding potential allies in the private sector or beyond those sometimes insular communities.
Okay, Nick, and then.
Well, I'm Nick from CIMA, from the Center for International Media Assistance. I'm the research manager here. A quick note that CIMA does not support, CIMA's name has been mentioned a lot, and it's wonderful to hear CIMA's name being mentioned in this room, but we just support mostly research and knowledge, and we try to strengthen the effectiveness of media development initiatives around the world through knowledge and dialogue. And NED is the organization that really supports projects around here. But with that said, I have two quick questions, if you'll allow me the indulgence. One is looking at funding flows in media development to LGBTI plus initiatives. We do see that actually, we have a data set that I could be able to confirm this with in about a month. I would say it's likely that kind of funding is rising for this issue. But that being said, many donors are still reluctant to fund this kind of work directly, as you say, putting it into health funding instead, or through other avenues. And yet all of you, in a variety of circumstances that are sometimes very difficult, are working really directly on these issues of media portrayal of LGBTI plus community. So what would be your response to donors that are still reluctant to work on these issues, either because they think, oh, we don't want the backlash, or we don't want to put people at risk, or this issue is just it's just too political for us? What would be your response to those donors? And then a second issue you haven't talked about. You've talked a little bit around the issue of digital being very positive for the LGBTI plus community, but there is a flip side in terms of the security, as you mentioned, phones being used against the community. And Tactical Tech in Brighton published an interesting report that looked at the advantages and the disadvantages of particularly social media for the community. There's a huge amount of risk, surveillance, that's putting a lot of people in danger, actually. And is there any programming that you're aware of that's effectively helping to, make digital interaction safer? Is that being effective? Can more be invested in that area? So those are my two questions. Thanks.
Okay, and then just one more question to the right.
Brian, we need to answer.
Okay.
Before you
We'll
add
answer those
another.
and then we'll come back to you. So let's start with Jennifer's questions about.
Communities.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Would anyone like to respond to that?
About communities that exist that
Traditions.
traditional. So in Nigeria, there's a community up in the north of the country called the Yandaudu, which they've always sort of been historically seen as what would be called trans now. And I think a lot of people have been studying that community. They're sort of similar to the ones in India as well. And a lot of them, I know that I've read a lot about it. A lot of them are sex workers, but they do have a safe community that has been known for decades. And people just didn't talk very much about it, but it was sort of, when like a common law situation. We knew these people were there, they existed, they have their own community, they're protected from the police by other people as well, so they have their own sort of codes and ethics that go on there. So there is, I think there definitely is that. So a lot of people have been using that community as a study into sort of pre-colonial sexuality, because that's the one that is sort of documented in the north of the country. I think that's that in that question.
Yeah, and she was also wondering about linkages to allies in the private sector or beyond, if anyone wants to respond to either of those.
I mean, I don't know about, in Nigeria, I don't know about a lot of people who are even sort of supportive or supposed allies don't even come out to say that they're allies. So it's kind of seen like if somebody does come out as an ally, I think it's like, okay, there's a lot of like, what's your intention regarding that?
Yeah, so for the first question, there's been a lot of academic research to talk about same-sex practices, pre-colonization. There was a really fantastic book that came out, I think it was 2006, it might have been a little bit earlier, called Boy Wives and Female Husbands, which was a comprehensive sort of country-by-country narratives around different same-sex practices and relationships. And we were talking about this a bit earlier, but in a lot of this pre-colonial research, homosexual relationships were not defined in the same way that we think about homosexual relationships in the West. So a lot of this research might talk about how a woman married a woman because she became widowed and she needed to now have a partner that helped to take care of her, but these were then, under these researchers, being classified as same-sex relationships. So I think when we talk about pre-colonial Africa, particularly from the lens of the West, when we talk about same-sex relationships, they're not always going to look like how we perceive them here. It's not always a main focus on sex. And as we know, marriage has always been an economic contract for a lot of people around the world for centuries anyway. So I think that research is happening. I think that when we talk about LGBT as a sort of umbrella term, it does somehow erase a lot of the cultural context in which we all work. And so there's kind of a conflict there. I don't know if it'll ever be enough to say that we have all this research, look at this research, this means that there were same-sex practices in Africa, if it doesn't fit within this mold of a Western creation of LGBT identity, if that makes any sense. So it's something that we're still talking about.
I wanted to add to that I think there's a lot of research into finding what the names of these communities would have been, or these practices would have been in those sort of languages at that point in time, because I think the idea is that colonization brought in the term sort of LGBT, and that it brought in homophobia as well. So I think a lot of the research that's happening is going into like a renaming or understanding the original naming of what this idea or practice or sexuality would have been in those communities at the time. So I'm aware that there is a lot of research going into that.
I think sorry.
Rosa.
In Uganda, we have many languages. But to tell you every language, there is a way they call the word homosexuality. So that means this thing, by the naming itself, which means it has been there from times, of our great ancestors. To me, all I say, the homophobia, all is the imported concept, but and as a result of the laws, for example, using a case study of Uganda. The law that criminalizes same-sex relations that we have now, the Penal Code Act Section 145, was left behind by the British. And it's the same law that is still being used to suppress the work of LGBT. But because to get you all be charged under the law, they have to get you in the act. That's why you see no one has ever been charged under the law, because maybe someone has to bring cameras and sleep on your door, which is very hard. But of course, the minister uses that. All the police uses the law to oppress the LGBT. But if you analyze history, we have research. People are now starting to write the stories about the bisexual king Kabaka Mwanga. If you read about Mwanga, every 3rd June, Uganda is Martyrs' Day. And this is a man who killed many converts because they had accepted Christianity, and they had really taken over and left behind their traditional way of worship, And some researchers are saying that this guy, this king, killed them because they refused sexual advances to the king, And research is coming out even when you go, because Namugongo, every 3rd, people pay homage. They move from Nigeria, people walk from Kenya, people walk from Malawi to come and respect the martyrs, because they say they were killed because of their faith. But research is bringing out that they were killed because of and they were telling the king, repent, otherwise God is going to punish you. So you can see there is the great cultural attachment. So all this is saying that homosexuality is an African, is a Western import. To me, and actually even other scholars will tell you, it's all used maybe as a scapegoat by these fundamentalists and everything. But the research is trying to bring out the truth.
Okay.
Yeah.
Martha, and then...
I'm sorry.
I just wanted to say, pre-colonial, yes, but I'm seeing a little bit of a shift post-colonial, actually, because in Namibia was under South African rule and German rule, and those are we inherited the sodomy law from Roman Dutch law. So post-colonial, Namibians are sort of saying, well, that was the law that was actually imposed. Homophobia was imposed on us, and what do we actually say about that? So I think that a little bit more the post-colonial, but I think it's difficult in some countries because especially countries that were under colonial rule, because Africa countries have a strong oral tradition. So actually finding almost empirical evidence of that kind of thing is a process, and there's a lot of hearsay and that kind of thing. So it's important to investigate these things to an extent, but I think that the post-colonial narrative also says that people are saying, you know, if we're all equal, Namibians, Nigerians, Americans, we're all human beings, then why wouldn't there be gay people in Namibia if we are all equal and humanist and humans?
Did you have one quick thing to add, Sylvie?
Yes, I'll be quick. But I wanted to talk about the question around intersectional organizing. I think that that's happening quite a bit across the continent, because I do think that activists, LGBT activists, know that they're not going to be able to, you know, change laws, you know, fight for decriminalization if they don't have support of other civil society organizations on the ground. And I think, you know, for example, looking at Rwanda after Uganda pushed for their anti-homosexuality bill, and what happened was in Uganda, when that bill passed, it really influenced things regionally. So countries that had never had anti-homosexuality bills suddenly had one, like Burundi, for example. But in Rwanda, there was a civil society coalition that stopped that from happening. So it couldn't have been the LGBT activists alone. It had to be the health practitioners. It had to be people who were working on women's rights, you know, people who were working on children's rights. So it was a coalition that helped to stop that. And I think as the community becomes more visible and as, you know, we grow, we can't work in a vacuum anymore. And I think, you know, it's just also, though, working with all of these other civil society organizations to deal with their own homophobia, which also stops them, and their transphobia, which stops them for working with LGBT organizations. So it's happening slowly.
To start to answer Nick's question, you know I'm going to plug the guide again. I have to, that's why I'm up here. We have a whole section on source safety and sensitivity, and a whole resource section at the back. So there's we specifically refer to the Samir Kassir Foundation Security in a Box community, which has a guide specifically for the LGBTI community in sub-Saharan Africa, so quite specific. And then also some work from the Electronic Frontier Foundation to manage some of those security issues. So Sally and I in our training in Cape Town last year had a session on that, and we'll do so again this year.
Can I talk about that a little bit?
Please do.
Okay, so there's been so much training happening around digital security, particularly in East Africa, I think all over. I think that the problem is that it's getting people to change their behaviors, you know, changing your passwords, keeping your data safe. And it's not happening as fast as it needs to happen. And this is for activists, not just LGBT activists. This is for all activists across the continent. Phones are, yes, like those things are happening. But there are organizations that are coming in. I'm not sure that people have quite they understand the urgency, but I do think there's been some changes in terms of how people are using social media.
Yeah, BenTech also, the Matters program, it was really wide. BenTech, the Matters, it's a software, it was widely taught and really across East Africa. I think also Kenya, they were there. So they are literally trying to tell people how to keep securing their information, how to keep on changing passwords, how to use maybe like search engines which are not exposing them to harmful malicious users online. So there is a big change. Even we have like organizations like Defenders, they have projects which are entirely, even like the DPI, Defenders Protection Initiative, they have projects entirely based, their work is entirely on that, digital security for human rights defenders. So we have organizations that are helping us in that, though it's a gradual process.
Yeah.
In terms of responding to the reluctance of donors, maybe Eric or anyone here has responses to that.
Yeah, I wanted to respond to the thing about donors. I think it's also important to sort of pinpoint people who you can trust, who are working on the front line, and support them really, because, you know, I know he talked about how a lot of the donor funds go through sort of health or human rights, but yes, there are people on the front line. And I think if you can identify them and you can, you know, verify that they're trustworthy, then I think it's important to work with those people as well. Because there are a lot of people doing great work, but then it's as though they can't get the support they need because they have to go through certain kinds of organizations.
Yeah, basically, giving our example, like producing this is really hectic, you know? And you know, you have yes, that's true. No, I'm telling the reality. I think that this is general. When the time of the bill, when will the donors, you know, there was that great hope, everything. But when the bill was annulled, the donors withdrew. So you can see back home, people are struggling. Some organizations have closed down, and if you present a project and they say, no, how sure are we? Maybe the bill is coming back again. So it's really a hustle around. Yeah.
Did you want to say something?
I would just say, as with anything, all projects get looked at for the quality of what they're proposing, and then over time, after a year or two of funding, the quality of the reporting, how you do your financial reports. And we also recognize, particularly in the type of work the endowment does, that people are operating in very complex environments, and particularly for these communities, it's that much more complex just on a daily basis. So these things do get factored in, but I would also say, like any advocacy initiative, doing this kind of linking you're talking about, doing sort of like building relationships across sectors, finding other partners, packaging your product so that donors can find a number of different things they can ting on, so that they can feel like, okay, I'm not just being too narrow. I think more and more donors are looking at cross-border work, they're working at relationships being built, connective tissue happening around and across issues.
Can I say something as well? I also think that there's a lot of donors who are working with other donors to explain why this is important to fund. And I think that work is really important. Yes, as activists or people on the ground, we can say, this is really important, please fund this. But it's also important that donors talk to each other and do that work as well. Because there are many foundations that fund on LGBT issues across the continent, have been doing it for decades and are doing it very well. So I think that's also part of donors' work as well.
We're nearly out of time. Let's take that final question, and then I think we'll have to probably wrap up there.
From Ned. My question is, with the power of social media, have you noticed like Nigerians or people from Kenya or any minorities that's in the UK or the US, have they supported you all like back home? And also, have you seen with recent influx of migration from Africans to like Afro-Caribbean countries like Trinidad and Tobago and stuff like that, where the LGBT community is same feedback, but is slowly getting more progressive? Have they seen an easier way of assimilating into the culture there, or have you gotten any sort of like research analysis or feedback on that?
Wow.
I know. No, I mean, I don't think I can answer that question comparatively. I don't, because I'm a journalist, so I'm not an activist. I'm not an LGBT activist. So I can't speak to that degree of that conversation. I think the only person sort of from the UK who is quite vocal about LGBT issues is Bisi Alimi. And he's constantly sort of in dialogue with Nigeria and talking about the issues that are going on there. So when somebody gets arrested, somebody gets kidnapped, he's kind of talking about it on social media as well. But again, sometimes that even poses certain dangers, because you make people feel emboldened, but you don't give them they don't have that security that you have because you're living in a different country. So that in itself can be very dangerous as well. You give people this, gusto to be like, oh, I want to say this, I want to write about this, but then, if they get arrested, where are you? So even within that, and I always say even within when you have sort of activists who were from Nigeria and are outside the country and are talking about the issues, they need to be very, very cognizant of the security issues that are on ground, the privileges that don't exist for some of these people in these communities where they live as well.
Yeah.
I want to talk about the migration. Recently, there's been an influx of Ugandans migrating to Kenya. Of course, when the bill was annulled, people were wondering why is it that the number of asylum seekers is rising when the bill was annulled. Of course, that was an illustration to show that how much the bill was annulled, the situation didn't change, because you might take out the law, but people's perception won't change. Most vocal activists really left home, and they came to really for their safety. And in this room, I've already seen someone from our country, Nikki. Yes, yes. Nikki is a Ugandan-based, one of the founders of the Ugandan LGBT movement, based here in DC. Of course, he had to come for the safety, and so it's real. We stay behind, but it's all we face the we face the environment. Yeah.
Any final thoughts from our other panelists, or feel free to answer that question?
In terms of diaspora communities, I think that there is a lot of support from diaspora communities. I think diaspora communities are still trying to figure out how they can support primarily financially or in other ways of putting pressure on governments. So that is happening. This is the first I'm hearing about LGBT refugees or immigration to the Caribbean, and I'm very interested to learn more about this. This is very interesting to me. But in terms of Kenya and a lot of refugees coming from Uganda, it hasn't been an easy situation for them also coming into Kenya. Kenya is also a very conservative environment, and when it is known that they are there as LGBT refugees, they face a lot of violence. And there's just not a lot of resources, so people end up homeless, doing sex work. So there's a lot of research around what's going on with Ugandan refugees in Kenya, which is an unfortunate situation. Yeah.
All right, I think we'll stop there. I'd really like to thank Seema and Ned for hosting us today. I'll also thank the Arcus Foundation and the Andrich Bull Foundation for helping us put the guide together.
Yay.
And then finally to our panelists for a really fascinating discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you.